Next, I want to discuss the anger that we see all around us in the public square in relation to riots which have been all across the country, and to ask what it shows about whether there's a deep-rooted frustration amongst the public. I would say there certainly is, and the question that I'm particularly interested in is who's driving it. Joining me to discuss this is former Conservative and UKIP Member of Parliament Douglas Carswell. Thank you for joining us from Mississippi.
Hello, lovely to be on your show. Thank you for having me.
No, it's a pleasure to hear from you. I'd like really simply to kick off by having you give us your take on the clearly spiralling unrest up and down the country, north and south, east and west. What's your interpretation of it?
A lot of it is justified anger because the British people have been lied to systematically. They've been lied to over immigration, both about the numbers and about the consequences. On numerous occasions, the British people have voted to reduce mass immigration. They did so in 2010, they did so in 2015, they did so in 2017, they did so in 2019. And far from controlling immigration, the Conservative government allowed immigration to get out of control, to the point where today in Britain, 1 in every 27 people has arrived in the past year. The year to date from June 2024, the previous year, the government allowed in over 1.1 million long-term settlers through the visa scheme. And that's only legitimate legal migration. That's not even taking into account the large-scale illegal migration such as that comes across the Channel every day. So I think there is justifiable anger that the composition of the country is being changed demographically in a very short space of time. Now, the second great lie about immigration is that immigration is a benefit. Now, immigration can be a benefit. I myself am talking to you from the United States, where I'm a migrant, I should say, a legal migrant. Legal migration can be very beneficial to a country. But you need to take into account not only the skills and the net value of the migrants, you need to take into account questions of cultural compatibility. And the truth is that if you accept large numbers of people into the country who have values that are not Western, that have values that conflict with Western assumptions about knowledge and the role of orthodoxy in society, you're creating long-term division in society. And people know this, and they can see the evidence with their own eyes, and they're fed up with it. They've been lied to. And I think the anger is really fueled by the idea that somehow there's something illegitimate and untoward and immoral about them complaining about this. So, yeah, I think people have every right to feel angry. I don't think it's intentional. I think the stupidity and the naivety of Western elites in believing in cultural relativism is the root cause of the problem in terms of why we can't get to grips with migration. It's not quite true that, I mean, there are tens of millions of people around the world who would like to come and live in the West. And there are tens of millions of people around the world who've got very good justification for wanting to abandon their rather horrible lives in tyrannical third world countries and want to move into the West. But we simply can't accept them all. We cannot be a lifeboat for everyone in the world who wishes to come here because they've got a horrible government. If you were to accept people simply because they're looking for a better life or trying to escape from tyranny, the West would become unrecognizable in a very short space of time. It's also not quite true to say that people from all backgrounds are moving. What's happening is people from non-Western societies are trying to get into Western societies. And I think this gives a lie to the Western elites' idea that somehow all cultures are the same. No, clearly people are voting with their feet and leaving those parts of the world that have bad political cultures, that produce bad outcomes, and they're moving to Western and, I would say, Anglosphere societies. There's a reason why people are moving from France to the UK, because Western and particular Anglosphere culture is more conducive to a happy, successful life. I think we need to recognise.
Bear with me, Douglas. Tom Buke in the studio. Do you accept that stupidity and naivety are enough of an explanation? This is a tsunami that's been building for a long time. Do you agree with Douglas Carswell that it's just been generational naivety?
There's no doubt our political class has lied to us over the last 2 decades about migration. I think Douglas is absolutely right on that. I think where I sort of depart from his narrative, and actually people who are generally perceived to be on the right of this debate, is I don't think all the explanations are purely cultural. I think they're also economic, in the sense that, take this country, why actually have successive Conservative governments not been able to bring net migration down? Why? Because we have a Treasury orthodoxy that prizes labour supply as a means of growing labour supply to grow the size of the cake, GDP. In other words, we've got governments, successive governments, that are not interested in growing the productive capacity of the British people, ensuring that they get a fair wage from the profits that get produced by our companies. They're on the side of big business often, and employers generally, who can see the benefits of, frankly, what's known as global labour arbitrage, where effectively you hold down the real incomes of people in this country and in other Western countries in that way. So I look at this more through an economic lens than a cultural lens, because, you know, someone that's lived all over the world, I think in general, people of all cultures, faiths and creeds do want to live side by side with their neighbours.
Douglas Carswell, do you see the merit of Tom Buick's economic emphasis in addition to
I think,
the point that you were making about culture and so on?
I think Tom makes a very good point and adds a further layer of explanation, and I think he's absolutely right. If you look at the atrocious productivity growth in Britain over the past 20 years, part of it is because, as he says, big business, big corporate interests in the Treasury have wanted to import cheap labour into this country. And during the referendum campaign on Brexit, interestingly, the leader of the Remain campaign at one point came close to admitting that if Britain were to leave the European Union and limit immigration, it would be a bad thing, he suggested, because big business might have to pay British workers more. So I think we can clearly see corporations and the Treasury have an interest in importing cheap labour, undoubtedly. But I don't think we can separate the economic from the cultural. I would argue that actually economic success is contingent upon cultural variables, and there's a reason, you know, not all cultures are the same, and not all cultures are capable of producing successful free market economies, and that you can't ultimately separate out the economic from the cultural. But I don't disagree with much of what Tom says.
Douglas Carswell, I'm just running short of time right now, but you're going to be joining us to pick up and to develop this conversation in the online continuation of this show. But thank you very much for the contribution you've made so far, and I'll look forward to picking the conversation up a little bit later. Very close to my heart, and it's a topic that I often try to grapple with on here. My next guest is GB News presenter, host of the show Free Speech Nation, Andrew Doyle. And Andrew has by now spent years discussing, debating, cogitating and arguing about this important topic. Thanks very much for joining me, Andrew.
Thanks for having me, Neil.
I listened again, I listened for the second time to a speech that you gave, I think at one of the Oxford colleges, I'm not quite sure, and it was about freedom of speech, and you cited Milton and Paradise Lost. I wonder if you could just develop that thesis a little bit for us just now.
Well, the reason I was talking about John Milton is because people obviously know him for his poetry for Paradise Lost, one of the greatest epic poems in the English language. But he also wrote a very important tract on freedom of speech called Areopagitica, which was a response to the state attempting to license, as in censor, all printed publications. The idea was that all printed publications would have to pass by the state. And he was effectively writing a treatise on freedom of the press and, by extension, freedom of speech, full stop. And he made lots of terrific arguments about why freedom was so important and why liberty generally is so important. And I was talking about that because I wanted to explain that there's been a long history of great thinkers in this country attempting to defend free speech, and that actually you don't have free speech and then you've got it forever. Every successive generation has to keep on arguing it. And that's why I like to draw on thinkers such as Milton or John Stuart Mill, who have done this, who've been here before. And from what's happening at the moment in this country, we have to have these arguments again. I don't think it's ever been more urgent.
I also, in preparing to talk to you, I re-listened to Rowan Atkinson's, what I thought was an excellent 10 minutes that he gave relatively recently, touching on many things about the crucial importance of freedom of speech. But he also made a point of saying that there must be freedom to be offensive, which I thought was, well, yeah.
Absolutely. So the major problem that we face at the moment is that there is a new ideological movement whose core belief is that language shapes our perception of reality, and therefore you need to curb language that can cause offence. And the idea is that words and violence are effectively therefore the same thing. And that's an ideology that has caught on in all major political parties, and it needs to be challenged. Because, I mean, this is, I think, what the current Labour government are doing in terms of their crackdown on free speech. You know, a lot of the people tweeting and posting things on social media are saying really vile things, but there is an assumption that those vile things incite violence, lead to violence, that words and violence are the same. That assumption has been tested over many decades of research. It's called media effects theory. We know that the public doesn't, in fact, act on cue to the words that they read online. It's simply not true. There's no evidence for it. And that really disturbs me. So I think we need to have a serious conversation about this assumption that there is a causal link between people saying horrible things, which is the price you pay for free speech, and actions that are taken by people who read those things.
Now, as you say, Andrew, there is a long history of people seeing the need to challenge any threat to freedom of speech. But nonetheless, it keeps on happening. And at the moment, as you rightly touch on, this idea of people being jailed, given substantial custodial sentences for posts on social media. And so clearly there is, I wonder if our generation's fight for freedom of speech, and you've been you're a principal campaigner in all of that, flagging up the threat to freedom of speech. It feels as if we're just losing the battle, that we're clearly not doing enough.
I think part of the reason we're losing the battle is that this is not a left-right issue anymore. You know, I think the Conservatives implemented a lot of policies and laws that I deem to be threatening to our liberty. For instance, they introduced the Police Crime and Sentencing Bill, where they wanted to give the police the power to arrest protesters if they were noisy, which, of course, most protesters are. And then you had the Online Safety Bill, which was a Conservative legislation, which now the Labour Party are revamping. They're making it even more draconian than it currently is. And as you say, we seem to be losing it because successive governments across the world, particularly the Western world, are implementing the most draconian hate speech measures. We've seen it with the hate speech bill in Scotland. Ireland actually has a definition in its new bill, its proposed bill. The definition of hatred is hatred. So it's a completely circular definition, which of course can be applied and exploited by any future government. And this is the key question that I think people aren't reckoning with. We see these horrible things online and we think, oh, I just want those to go away. I wish the people who said that, they're obviously repugnant people. So what's wrong if we lock them up? But you're asking the wrong question there. The question that you should be asking is, which is preferable? Which is safer? Having a society in which people are free to say whatever they want, and that includes people saying really, really despicable things, on the one hand, or on the other hand, empowering the state to imprison its citizens because of what they say. And anyone who knows anything about history will know about the dangers of that latter option. That's the argument that we need to be having. It's not the argument that we are having.